Hello, I'm Jonathan Hall with Cornell University Press, and I am proud to introduce two Cornell authors to you, Julie Miller and Alasdair Roberts. Julie Miller is author of the new book, Cry of Murder on Broadway, A Woman's Ruin and Revenge in Old New York, just published this month by Cornell University Press. Julie began this book with the Bernard and Irene Schwartz Fellowship from the New York Historical Society. Her first book was Abandoned, Foundlings in 19th-Century New York City, published by NYU Press in 2008. In 2005, when that book was still in manuscript, it won the Dixon Ryan Fox Prize, which was offered by New York History, which we now proudly publish. Julie taught in the history department at Hunter College from 2001 to 2009 before moving to Washington, D.C. While in D.C., she has been featured on the Washington Post podcast, Presidential. Alasdair Roberts, fellow Cornell Press author, is professor of public policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and is director of its School of Public Policy. Alasdair is the author of 3 books with Cornell University Press: America's First Great Depression, Economic Crisis and Political Disorder After the Panic of 1837, The End of Protest, and most recently, Strategies for Governing. So welcome to the conversation. I look forward to hearing you discuss early American history. So the book that we're going to be focused on and centering on is Julie's new book, Cry of Murder on Broadway, A Woman's Ruin and Revenge in Old New York. The woman in the book is Amelia Norman. Who was Amelia Norman and what is her story?
Amelia Norman she was born around 1818 on a farm in New Jersey, in northwestern New Jersey in the mountains. And like a lot of young people in the first half of the 19th century, she came to New York City in her case, New York City, many people went to big cities to work. And she became a domestic servant, which is what was the job that most young women who did paid work did. And she settled quite well in New York City. She worked as a servant for a family that she knew from home, and she made friends. But then what happened was there was an economic collapse called the Panic of 1837, which we will get to, and a resulting depression. And as a result, her circumstances changed, and she apparently lost her job. The family that she worked for actually owned a soap factory, which seems to have gone out of business. And she had a series of more short-term jobs. And then she took up with a wealthy merchant named Henry Ballard. And they were together for a while, and they had a child, and then he dropped her. And when she approached him for money to support herself and her child, he told her that she could go and get her living as other prostitutes do. Then the focus of my story, the reason the book is called Cry of Murder on Broadway, is because on the evening of November 1st, 1843, she followed him up the steps of the city's newest, most luxurious hotel, the Astor House Hotel, and she stabbed him. And there was a trial, and the trial attracted a lot of attention. And also Norman attracted the interest and the support of the popular author and abolitionist, Lydia Maria Child, who took her side. So one of the questions I ask in the book is, why was this would-be murderess so popular? In other words, what was it about her that made people side with her, even though she had so obviously really done this terrible thing? And here I should just say that she was acquitted, that the jury, there were no women on the jury in 1844. Her trial was in January of 1844, it was all men. And these men, from what I could tell, were mostly sort of small traders, a man who sold something called fish tackle, somebody else who had a stall in the market, but a few more prosperous people. There was someone described as a broker, for example. But all of these men agreed. They listened to a week's worth of testimony where it was perfectly clear that she had, in fact, stabbed Henry Ballard. I mean, she had been witness doing this. And yet, after hearing a week's worth of testimony, they deliberated for less than 10 minutes, and they decided that she was not guilty. And there was huge celebration in the city. People had been reading this in the newspapers for a week. James Gordon Bennett, the editor of the New York Herald, had been following this case closely. and he was on her side. So, the question that I asked is what made her so popular? And I think this gets to the atmosphere of the moment, part of which was an economic depression, which we'll talk about in a minute. This is a period, as you may recall, of tension between the North and the South over slavery. So there's a tremendous amount of I think we talk now about how there's a great deal of anger and mistrust between different political sides. That was certainly true in the 1840s. This is the period of the abolition movement. The abolitionists in their early phase were very, very radical. It was a time when the economy was changing. So in other words, people who were used to being small artisans were sort of losing their workshops in favor of larger businesses. And all of this combined to make someone like Henry Ballard, who was a merchant, really very unpopular. The other thing that's important here is that this is a period where people were very interested in stories. So this is a period when people went to hear popular preachers. They listened for hours to political speeches. This is the period when the penny press developed. The 1830s was when the penny press was first invented in New York City. This is the period when the mystery novel and investigative journalism were both developed. So people went to the courtroom as if they were going to the theater. The theater was very popular for people of all classes in New York. So people were just hungry for stories. And they knew, for example, the story of the seduction novel was popular. So people were able to see Amelia Norman and Henry Ballard in a sense as sort of almost fictional figures. And it wasn't irrelevant that Eugene Sue's profoundly popular novel, Mysteries of Paris, which was first published in France, appeared in New York exactly at the same time as this was going on. So people mixed up Amelia Norman with the heroine of Eugene Sue's novel, who was this sort of pure character. Amelia Norman, meanwhile, was somebody who said, I wish I had killed the damn Yankee. So she was not exactly the same kind of a person, and yet people were willing to think that. Now here I think it makes sense to pause for a moment and ask Alasdair, who was the expert on the Panic of 1837, if he could explain just what the Panic of 1837 was.
Yeah, sure. And I got to say right off the top, I really enjoyed reading this book. It was really entertaining. And I actually found when I was reading it, I thought, boy, this story would make a great movie because there are so many vivid scenes in this book. You really do a great job of just kind of conveying to folks a sense of what life was like, the tumultuous character of daily life, especially in New York City, and the trial, the depiction of the trial is something else, and maybe we can circle back to that a bit later on. But I was going to say the story is sort of almost Dickensian, but Dickens is actually in the story, so. Basically, my book, America's First Great Depression, talks a bit about the Panic of 1837, but the basic argument is that there is this crisis that starts with a financial collapse in 1837-38, but the theme of the book is the way in which a financial crisis metastasizes into first an economic crisis, there's a depression, and then a political crisis, because as resources become scarce, all of the sort of pre-existing political tensions get aggravated, including the North-South tension. Politics gets very, very nasty by the early 1940s. And it also becomes a sort of political, social cultural crisis as well. There's tensions between different ethnic communities, different racial communities. And by 1842, 1843, there's just this kind of pervasive sense in the country that something has gone awry, that things are destabilized. And I wonder whether that feeds into the story here. But as Julie says, there's also other things going on as well. There's the There's the advent of literacy and the penny press. People are reading and talking more, but there's the emergence, I guess, of a public sphere, and this story feeds into that. It's an era of democratization. It's an era in which power is being pushed down to the common person. More people are voting, for example, in elections than ever before. This notion that voting belonged to the property is basically fading away at this period. And then it's also a period of rapid urbanization. It's the period where like a city like New York is getting big really fast, and people can lose themselves in the city. And I wondered whether part of the story here is just about the way in which folks are trying to, I suppose, restore order or establish order in this rapidly growing city. But I thought it was a wonderful story.
Thank you. I think the question about disorder in city life is obviously central to the story of Amelia Norman. And I think reformers like Lydia Maria Child, for example, like to imagine that the countryside, they romanticize the countryside in this period, and they argued that, everything pure and calm was to be found in the country, and everything disorderly and immoral was to be found in the cities. But one of the things that I discovered when I was learning about Amelia Norman is that she came from a place that was in fact very violent. New Jersey, for example, had slavery up until 1860, I believe. So, and slavery was just one of the inherently violent aspects of the area she grew up in. It was also a place where the iron industry was important, and her father and brothers were involved in that. They had iron forges, and the iron industry was like loud and hot and brutal. It was really pretty terrible. She also came from a family where there was quite a lot of violence. Two of her brothers were involved in crime. Her grandfather was a horse thief. I mean, most members of her family were perfectly ordinary farmers going about their business, but there was this streak of violence that she was exposed to as a young person. So this myth of the countryside, as a sort of a pure place, was very much a counterpart to the bewilderment that many people felt in growing cities. So that I think that's an important part. You mentioned the trial. One of the things that I found interesting about the trial is that the lawyers were really performers, and they, for example, I used in the book all these snippets of poetry as epigrams or epigraphs at the tops of the chapters, because there was so much poetry that they quoted or that they wrote, and that lawyers in New York could expect the courtroom audiences to recognize really pretty obscure, snippets of poetry from Shakespeare and other authors that, we might not, that contemporary audiences couldn't be expected to know. But the other thing is that the trial was not the only popular trial. It was, in a sense, a kind of like people went to trials very much like you might watch a television series. In other words, that it was every week there was actually like a kind of a schedule in the courtroom, and you could see what was coming up next. And people would attend these trials, and they would read about them in the newspapers. There were trial reports in the newspapers. That was one of the things that the penny press did. So some of them were bigger than others, and this was a big one. But it was something. It was part of the culture to absorb these kinds of stories. The other thing I should just say, one of the things that I kind of discovered when I was doing this is that when you think of the concept of the fallen woman, which we think of as typical of this period, the word ruin is often used. But after the Panic of 1837, which I should say was one of a series of economic collapses in the 19th century, approximately every 20 years, there was such a collapse. But the word ruin obviously was used to refer to economic ruin. But I think one of the reasons that the jurors and the public were willing to be sympathetic to Amelia Norman was that many of them had been ruined. And one of the results of Amelia Norman's trial is that her lawyer, who was a fascinating, forgotten character, she had three lawyers actually, but the principal lawyer was David Graham Jr., who was actually a kind of a prodigy at a very young age. He was writing textbooks that were used for decades, and he was actually his father, his family were immigrants from Ireland, but in an earlier wave, not in the 1840s, actually in the early 19th century. And he was very sympathetic to Amelia Norman, and he evidently learned from Lydia Maria Child something about the unequal experience of women in an economic, in the economy as it stood, and especially at a time of economic depression. And when New York revised its constitution in 1846, they decided to revise their code of laws. And Graham was on a commission to do that. And it was a very big process. And one very small part of it was a clause 604, section 604, titled seduction. And it gave a woman the right to sue on her own behalf for seduction. And prior to that, seduction was defined in law as a loss of services to a woman's master or father. Her father was her master. This is from English law. The idea was that if a single woman was seduced and therefore could not work, presumably because she became pregnant or because she lost her mind and died or whatever it was that was supposed to happen to her, that the way it was interpreted was she herself didn't really have the right to her work, that her master owned her work, and that he could sue for her loss of services. So in the first half of the 19th century, when people are starting to argue in favor of women's rights and for abolition, increasingly the notion of individual rights was very much gaining ground. And this was considered, no longer something that could stand. So Lydia Maria Child, for example, she devoted a column to Amelia Norman's trial, and she wrote about this. She said, let me see if I could find this. She wrote, in regard to Amelia Norman's seduction, what is the redress for a broken heart, blighted reputation, the desertion of friends, the loss of respectable employment, the scorn and hissing of the world? Why the woman must acknowledge herself to be the servant of somebody who may claim wages for lost time. Let us sweep this contemptible insult from the statute book. Well, David Graham, Amelia Norman's lawyer, was responsible for actually sweeping the contemptible insult from the statute book. He actually did that. So that's interesting. And in the arguments that his commission made, they actually equated a woman's ruin with a man's ruin because of financial fraud. So they're basically saying that when a woman is seduced, she's been defrauded, that she was perhaps, it's not exactly the same as a breach of promise of marriage. These things are close, but not exactly the same. But the idea was that she was lured into something and she was cheated. And at a time of economic stress, when lots of men had also lost their money, including, by the way, Henry Ballard's lawyer, who had lost his money in the crash, it was something that people could sympathize with. So the concept of ruin, I think, is much more complex than we usually give it credit for. I think we think of sexual ruin as being this sort of Victorian thing that no longer exists. But I think it's much more complicated. And I think the clue is in what Lydia Maria Child, she says, the loss of respectable employment. Because when women could do so few jobs, and most of them were servants, and if they had children as a result of their seduction, very often they lost their jobs because they were live-in servants and their employers didn't want to house them and their children. Ruin was not just loss of moral reputation, it was loss of your means to make a living. So ruin became, women were sort of allowed in this period, it was understood that women too could be ruined in a way that had an economic dimension.
Julie, could you just maybe just for the folks who are listening, tell a bit about who the judges were in the trial?
Yeah, the judges, well, there were three of them. And the principal one was Frederick Augustus Talmadge. Now, Frederick Augustus Talmadge is sort of a fabulous name. He was the son of none other than Benjamin Talmadge, who was the head of the Culper spy ring during the Revolutionary War. He worked for, I forget what his code name was. Well, the Culper spies all had code names. I can't remember what his was. And they also had aliases. So he was a spy. So Frederick Augustus Talmadge, his father, was a spy. But this is years later, and Frederick Talmadge grew up in, upstate New York.
And was he an alderman, though? The thing that struck me was that they're not actually judges.
That's right. The Court of Sessions was made up of city officials, aldermen, and their city recorder. And Talmadge was the city recorder. And the personnel of the Court of Sessions changed. So, if she had her trial a different year, she would have had a different set of judges. But Talmadge, and the other two didn't really say much of anything. It was really Talmadge who was the central judge there. But he was a conservative figure. And I think it's important to remember that his father was an important figure in the Revolutionary War, right? So he's seeing himself as upholding, the values of the Constitution, essentially. He was a Federalist. So his father was a Federalist. So Litchfield, he came from Litchfield, Connecticut, and he was a graduate of the famous Litchfield Law School there. And then, so he grew up in one sort of environment, and then he comes to sort of, Jacksonian New York, which is a much wilder political environment. So in other words, his heritage is one of, federalism and George Washington and the first couple of administrations. But in his own life, he was experiencing Jacksonian democratic expansion and the rise of working people and the breakdown of slavery and the beginnings of the women's movement. And a couple of years later was the Astor Place riot, not to be confused with the Astor House Hotel. The Astors had a lot of money, so a lot of things are named after them. And during the Astor House riot, Talmadge, as city recorder, actually stood in the street and read the Riot Act, which is, the Riot Act, which we forget was actually an act, because people were throwing stones, and that was very much a sort of a class conflict moment. One of the people who was rioting said, they require us to wear white gloves, and we're not wearing white gloves when we go to the opera, that sort of thing. So Talmadge was an interesting figure, and the picture of him in the book is interesting too, because he's very, when you read about him, he sounds so stern and kind of, rigid maybe. But when you look at that picture, he actually looks rather sympathetic, which is, I think, quite interesting. And so he is an interesting character. The other interesting character in the court was Jonas Phillips, who was the, the equivalent of I think he was the acting district attorney, and he had actually been a playwright. So which a fair number of people who were in the courts in New York had also come from the theater, which I think is not a coincidence. So Jonas Phillips, before he became acting district attorney, he wrote as many as 70 plays, with a couple of example titles are The Evil Eye, The Polish Wife, and The Cross of Death. And then he left behind his theater career and he became a lawyer, which was, I think, he was not the only lawyer or judge in New York who brought an enthusiasm for the theater and even a background in the theater to his work in the courtroom. That's all I have to say about that.
And the interesting thing of this trial is that, as you say, the lawyers are playing they're not playing to the judges, they're playing to the crowd, and it's a dramatic instance of jury nullification, because the facts are pretty straightforward about the attack. But to what extent would you say that this was sort of that the jury decision and sort of the public reaction was sort of I don't know, class warfare is maybe a little too strong, but a kind of populist assault, an expression of populist anger at the status quo, at the establishment, at this sort of the general state of affairs. Would you go that far?
Yes, because in the courtroom there was violence directed at Henry Ballard. And the way he was characterized by Norman's lawyers was a merchant. They never failed to describe him as a merchant, as someone who was someone who was essentially taking advantage of the public. He was making money by illicit means. He wasn't someone who worked with his hands. And furthermore, he was someone who took advantage of respectable families, seduced their daughters, and left them to ruin. And these things were combined in people's minds, that both the economic thievery and, defrauding was equated with the sexual thievery and defrauding. So that was part of it. There's another element here, though, which has to do with older ideas about honor. And typically men who killed their wives, lovers, married men, were acquitted. So this is in the tradition. There was even something called the unwritten law, which was meant to refer to that. And Norman's acquittal is part of that tradition, actually. I mean, it was to some, women did that much less often. There were much less, the aggressors in the situation, but they too were very often acquitted. There was a lot of sympathy for women. And I think when you read seduction novels, the heroine of the seduction novel, her punishment that the author allots her is that she dies, right? That's what she's supposed to do, which Amelia Norman did not do. But the sympathy of the reader and the author is clearly on the side of the seduced woman. So that was established in both law and culture.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we're getting close to our time limit, but I did want to ask one final question. What difference, if any, did Norman's actions ultimately make?
Well, one of the things I wanted to show when I wrote this book is that, unlike some books that have subtitles like The Law That Changed the Entire World or The Case That Made Everything Possible or whatever, I wanted to show that this is a little bit different, that in fact, Amelia Norman was, in her time, she was very well known and she was remembered for quite a few decades afterwards, but of course by now we have forgotten her. But the period of time when Norman stabbed Henry Ballard and her trial made a big splash was also just a couple of years later, the period of the first convention for women's rights at Seneca Falls, New York, and the passage of the Married Women's Property Act, which was passed in April 1848, just 1 month after a law to criminalize seduction was passed. Now, the law in New York, there was a group of people called the New York Female Moral Reform Society who had been agitating to criminalize seduction, in other words, to jail men who had seduced women. And they succeeded at that in 1848. And one of the ways that they did that was by latching onto Amelia Norman's case and using it as an example of why seduction should be criminalized. Now, we've forgotten these things. We remember that there was a movement to get the vote for women, right? The suffrage movement that started arguably in 1848 and culminated in the 19th Amendment, whose centenary we celebrate this year. But actually, there was a lot more than that going on. There were many in other words, that there was not a straight path from there to here. The culture that produced the early women's rights movement and the movement for suffrage was a very different culture than the one that we live in now. It was influenced by people who we have forgotten and by events that we have forgotten. And one of the things I wanted to show is that all of these things, some of them really very chaotic, very unintended, very accidental. In other words, when Amelia Norman went to stab Henry Ballard on the Astor House steps, she was arguably thinking more of herself than of the long-term status of women. But I think that the rage that she expressed was the rage that the women who were involved in the women's movement similarly felt. Lydia Maria Child certainly did. And in fact, she wrote the editorial, the column that she wrote devoted to Amelia Norman. There are several versions of it. In the second version, she cut out the angrier parts of it because I think she was alarmed at her own tone. And in the book, I reproduce that column and I show what she cut. So these women were really very angry, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who said when she spoke to the New York legislature, she said, really, I think very dramatically, she said, this is in 1854, would to God you could know the burning indignation that fills woman's soul when she turns over the pages of your statute books and sees there how like feudal barons you freemen hold your women. I mean, that's a pretty dramatic thing to stand up in front of New York's legislature and say in 1854. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the daughter of a lawyer. She knew she was a very well-educated person, probably more than most women of her time. Amelia Norman didn't even know how to write. So she didn't have access to the ability to express anything like that. She came from a violent background. She expressed herself in violence. She clearly was not violent all the time. She had a very successful life other than that beforehand. But I think that even though Amelia Norman's actions, appear to be random and personal, I think they express something about the tone of that moment, which included the Panic of 1837 and the Depression and the Reform movement and the sectional tension and all these things that were going on, the changes in the economy. And she was subject to all of that. And she wasn't someone who was literate enough to express it in words, but she expressed it nonetheless, and people recognized that expression.
Excellent, excellent. Well, it was too short, but if anyone is interested in learning more, please go to our website, cornellpress.cornell.edu. Type in Julie Miller. There's the book, Cry of Murder on Broadway, A Woman's Ruin and Revenge in Old New York. There they are, they both have it. And if you're interested, you can look at Julie's earlier book, Abandoned, as well as Alasdair's books, America's First Great Depression, The End of Protest, and Strategies for Governing. So it was a pleasure listening in, and you guys are a wealth of information and knowledge on this time period. And it was great to hear both of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan and Alasdair.
Okay. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.